So the key here is to see how Socrates uses the structure of the city as a model for the structure of the individual soul or individual human being or human nature in general. He says again at top page 122, we would expect an individual to have these same kinds of things in his soul. And what are these things that he has, each of us supposedly has in his soul? Well, the first distinction is the one that he makes between desires or appetites and what he calls the calculating element, which is really reason or rationality, and that's done on page 127. Next to margin number 5 towards the bottom, Socrates says it would not be unreasonable for us to claim then that there are two elements different from one another, and these are two elements in the soul, which is really the self or the human being as a whole. And to call the element in the soul with which it calculates the rationally calculating element, and the one with which it feels passion, hunger, thirsts, and is stirred by other appetites, the irrational and appetitive, and this having to do with appetites or desires, the appetitive element. So there are two elements in the soul, Socrates says, at least two elements, the rational part that thinks, and the appetites or desires which are irrational, or really non-rational, the non-thinking part of us. And to sort of round things off, and to get the necessary third element, we look at page 129 next to margin number 441. He says, or rather, just as there were three classes in the city that held it together, the money-making, the auxiliary, and the deliberative, which is the guardians, the wise ones, is there also this third element in the soul, the spirited kind, which is the natural auxiliary of the rationally calculating element. And this spirited part can be thought of as the will or willpower. So what would be good now is to look at the diagrams that I've included for this week, little sketches of Socrates' view of the individual soul. He's laying out a theory of human nature in which we have a rational part, which thinks. We have a desiring part, which desires and has appetite. And in the middle, we have what is called the spirited part. Now, this isn't spirit in the terms of like a religious notion of spirit. The spirited part in the sense that we can use the word spirit as applies to a spirited horse, or having spirit, like at a pep rally or something silly like that, but spirited in that sense, rigorous, willful, the kind of spirit that a soldier would have to take part in a battle. So we have these three parts, and lo and behold, these three parts match up with the three parts of the city. That is, the rational part of the self matches up with the guardian class, which is presumed to be the knowledgeable and rational class. The spirited or willful part of the self matches up with the soldiers or auxiliaries, and the desires or appetites match up with the moneymakers, since after all their lives are can be fairly described as being devoted to satisfying their desires. Now, of course, if we see this theory of human nature in its bare form, all we have are three parts of the self, the rational, the spirited, and the desires or appetites. But if we think about what we're looking for here in terms of justice, of course, we have a model in the city for what justice is. Justice in the city is when each social class is performing its special function, when the guardians are ruling, when the auxiliaries are carrying out the will of the guardians and fighting wars, protecting, and when the moneymakers, or the largest and bottom class, are obeying. Now, if we apply that model of justice to the self, then we get a very interesting idea of what justice means in the individual. What is justice in the individual? Perhaps the best description of it is on page 132, towards the bottom, next to margin letter D. He says, and in truth, justice is, it seems, something of this sort. Yet it is not concerned with someone's doing his own job on the outside. On the contrary, it is concerned with what is inside, with himself really, and the things that are his own. It means that he does not allow the elements in him each to do the job of some other. Instead, he regulates well what is really his own, rules himself, puts himself in order, becomes his own friend, and harmonizes the three elements together, just as if they were literally the three defining notes of an octave, lowest, highest, and middle. And so, justice in the self turns out to be each part of the self doing its own work, doing what it's supposed to do, and not doing the work of another. So, what is the work of each part of the self? That is, what would it mean for the self to be just, as a sort of internal sense of justice, not justice in the social sense? If we look at page 130, towards the middle of the page, above margin number 442, just about number 5, Socrates says, next to margin letter E above that, Socrates says, we should also bear in mind then that in the case of each one of us as well, the one in whom each of the elements does its own job will be just and do his own job, certainly. Then isn't it appropriate for the rationally calculating element to rule, since it is really wise and exercises foresight on behalf of the whole soul, and for the spirited kind to obey it and be its ally? And a little bit farther down, again, next to number 5, Socrates says, and these two elements, having been trained in this way and having truly learned their own job, so the job of reason or the calculating element is to rule, the job of the spirited part is to obey and be the ally of kind of the muscle, the willpower of the rational part, will be put in charge of the appetitive element, the largest one in each person's soul, and by nature the most insatiable from money. So what are the jobs, or what's the proper role of each one of the parts of the self? Well, the rational part should rule, says Socrates, since it is like the guardians in the city. The desires, the appetites, being most like the moneymakers of the city, should obey. That is, should basically the desires should be controlled by, be ruled by reason, or the calculating part. And this middle part should be the ally of reason, to carry out the orders of reason, to enforce the orders of reason on the desire. So we get our answer through and we get a theory of human nature, that is, that each each individual is made up of three parts, just like the city. And that's really the whole reason that he has sketched this city, is to provide a model, I claim. The whole reason he sketched the city is to provide a model for a theory of human nature, the three-part theory of human nature. And if again, look at the diagram that I put up for this week's learning module, comparing the parts of the self with the parts of the city. You'll see that they match up, and that really, I think that's the reason we built the city in the first place. So justice in the individual is when each part of the self is doing what it's supposed to do. And that would mean reason ruling, the desires obeying, and the spirited part of the will carrying out the orders of reason. I think we need to talk a little bit about exactly where we are then at the end of Book 4, which is both an assessment of this theory of human nature, an assessment of these claims about what it means to be just, an assessment about where they are in terms of the central question, whether the just person is better off than the unjust person, and maybe looking ahead as to why the book goes on, if indeed Socrates has done what he set out to do.